right rear camera. I have to get it repaired.
Okay.
Hi, welcome to Part 35 on the Lackawanna Cut-Off. Amtrak has been here before on November 13th, 1979. Hi, I'm Chuck Walsh, and I'm here with Mike Wikman in San Antonio, Texas, of all places. Why are we going to be here in San Antonio? Well, we'll let you know about that. We have a couple of interviews to talk about for November 13th, 1979 with Amtrak. So we're going to be talking to Mike in a little bit. Our first interview, however, is back in New Jersey, of all places. That's where the cutoff is, of course. We'll be talking to Bill Sheppard and Dominic Keating, as well as Jerry Cruz. So here we go to that interview, and we'll be talking about what happened back in 1979, but of course it's quite relevant to what's happening now in 2023. So here we go.
Take care. Bye.
November 13th, 1979. You're here about midday or so, and you see something. What, or hear something too? What,
yeah.
What is it?
Well, I was minding the store, but there was a lull in between. A friend of mine came and we were playing catch out here with a baseball, and we heard something going on the railroad. There was nothing running on the railroad for years, and we got all excited. We didn't know what it was. We looked up, and you can see the track very well from right here. You can't now because of the trees and the vegetation that has grown up, but it was a passenger train going west. It was Amtrak. We recognized the color scheme and the cars, and it was one engine and two passenger cars. And we got all excited, hoping that the Amtrak was coming back and putting trains back on from Scranton so we can go to the city again. And we didn't know what it was at first, but later on we found out that it was an Amtrak train, and we got, like I said, got all excited that the service was coming back, but nothing ever materialized. And
we're actually going to talk about that because it may, in fact, come back. We'll see. How far is the cutoff?
The cutoff was about a half a mile that way, but you could see the track very well from here.
And Johmsonburg Station is.
Johmsonburg Station is right over here. You can't see it from here, but it was very accessible. You could walk there, walk around. They had a station, they had an unloading dock, a bumper block, plenty of parking. And it was an old lover's lane at one time up there. And on the other side of the track was the Sheffield Creamery. They had a siding where they used to unload coal for their boiler. But everything down there, up there now, is torn down. The kids burnt down both buildings, and then the kids were getting hurt up there, and the state came in and tore everything out. They dynamited the concrete. There's nothing there now. It's a ghost town there now.
There's only a floor of the station now.
Floor of the station there.
Okay, so next we have some more interviews to be taking place here about the cutoff and November 13th, 1979. Okay, our two interviewees today are Bill Sheppard and Dominic Keating. And there's just so many questions I want to ask you guys, but I'm going to start with you, Bill, and give us your background. Where do you grow up? How do you get interested in railroads? How do you end up, what do you do? How long did you work, and so forth? Because we want to talk about how Amtrak in November of 1979 comes into play, but both you guys are involved with the lead up to what happens on that date long before that train actually runs. So Bill, give us as much detail as you like. I mean, where'd you grow up, and how do you how do you end up working for, well, at one point the Erie Lackawanna, Conrail, and so forth?
Well, I grew up in the city of Newark, New Jersey, opposite Roseville Avenue Station, where the Montclair branch diverged from the Morristown line. And
around 10 o'clock tomorrow, so I don't miss one.
that junction was controlled by a signal tower called Roseville Avenue Tower. And
You see the guy, tell him I need that stuff there.
I started hanging out, watching the trains from the apartment house that I lived in. It was a 10-story apartment house. I could look out and see the network of rail lines from the building, and watch the passenger trains going up to Scranton, and the electric trains operate. There was some freight trains that ran that way, and as a result of my interest in the railroads, my mother, who was a public school teacher, would take me on trips, generally over the holidays, the Christmas holidays, and we would ride the Phoebe Snow from Brickchurch station to Scranton and back. And that would take us over the Cut-Off, the New Jersey Cut-Off. I remember taking those trips in the wintertime and looking down from the embankments and seeing various other rail lines underneath, such as the Sussex branch, the Lehigh and Hudson River Railroad, Lehigh and New England Railroad, and the Susquehanna Railroad underneath. And you could see them clearly, especially if there was snow on the ground. And the reason I mention this is that all of those lines have been abandoned, and including the line that I was riding on. So those were the days, though, that things were active. And we would go to Scranton and change, and we'd get the Phoebe Snow back, and it was a nice day trip to take. And as the years went on, after school, I would, at age 9, I would go over to Roseville Avenue Tower, and they would allow me to switch the trains for the rush hour, and until it was time for dinner, and I would then go home. So that was my first interest into what it was like to work on the railroad. And
I assume you liked it.
yes, it was very, very nice. Roseville Avenue Tower sat on top of a cut. People couldn't really see me in the tower, but I could peer down and see all the trains that were going by at the time. After that, my father passed away the day before I turned age 14. I grew up in an area where there were a lot of railroaders living. They stepped up and offered me to take trips to Branchville, trips to Scranton, trips on passenger trains, and which I gladly did. And they gave me a good chance to see how things work. And I then expanded my territory to include taking freight train trips to Buffalo on weekends, sometimes on the Lackawanna, sometimes on the Erie. Would ride the Lehigh Valley, ride the Reading Railroad, and got to know a wide variety of railroad networks and how they functioned compared to one another. In 1965, I started, when I was starting on the first year of college, I went in and I wrote a letter to William White, the chairman of the Erie Lackawanna Railroad at the time. The merger occurred in 1960, which was the year my father passed. And in 1965, I went to the New York office and was given, I met with Milton McGinnis, who was the vice chairman at the time. He was formerly the chairman of the Erie, but when William White came by, he became the vice chairman. And he arranged for me to take freight trains, provided that I had a ticket, because he didn't want to see me get in trouble with the ICC. So I would pick up the phone and arrange for to take freight train trips all over the Erie Lackawanna system. And then later that year in '65, I started working at South Orange Tower, which was an Armstrong plant with big levers. I went on to work for the Erie Lackawanna as a towerman operator, qualified at 20 towers on the New York division, including Port Morris Junction, which controlled the New Jersey Cut-Off. And so I was familiar with that territory as well. And after that, I got my master's degree and came back to work again for the Erie Lackawanna as inspector of operations. Was put in charge of the piggyback operations at Croxton Yard in Jersey City, and helped secure a major client for the Erie Lackawanna known as the United Parcel Service. And I then taught school and went back to work as a towerman for the Erie Lackawanna, and did that for a number of years and wrote several books. One of them here is the schematic diagram book of the Erie Lackawanna New York Division, which caught the attention of the United States Railway Association in Washington, D.C. That was an organization that was formed to consolidate all the bankrupt railroads in the eastern United States. And I was placed on loan to the USRA in Washington, D.C., and with my knowledge of not just Erie Lackawanna, but the I-Valley, CNJ, New York Central, all these other lines played an important role in showing how things could be consolidated, put together, knowing the pluses and minuses of the various routes involved. When Conrail started on April 1st of 1976, I was put in management in the city of Newark on the Atlantic region, and worked there until 1980, and then was promoted to work in Philadelphia until I retired from Conrail 20 years later in '96. While I was on the Atlantic region, that's when I took a trip over the New Jersey Cut-Off in 1979. And the last freight train through freight train that went over the line was in 1978. And that train that ran that way was subsequently shifted to run on the former Erie side, which the track had been upgraded thanks to the assistance of New York State. And but I rode on the trip over the New Jersey Cut-Off. We started train equipment, I believe, came in at Kearny Junction, went to Hoboken, where the train originated for that day, and we went up to Denville and proceeded to Y the entire train around the Y track at Denville Station.
So you reversed the train?
Yes, we reversed the train, and I'll explain why. We then shoved the train all the way up to past Port Morris to a place called Sussex Branch Junction, and proceeded to pull through what was left of Port Morris Yard around the Y to get onto the New Jersey Cut-Off for the trip to Scranton.
Facing in the right direction. with
Facing in the
locomotive
right
in front.
direction. Now, the reason that we had to do that move is earlier in 1979, I believe it was in April, Port Morris Junction was closed, and the signal tower was, and a revised or a new interlocking plant called Morris Junction was installed with one switch, remote controlled from Dover Tower. And that allowed trains to move on the double track up to Morris Junction and then on to the Netcon branch and then the Washington line around Netcon. And but at that point, you could not make a progressive move onto the New Jersey Cut-Off except by going through the Y and Port Morris Yard, and that's exactly what we did on the day that we took the trip. And so at this point, I will turn this over to a person who rode the train with me on the trip, and Dominic can remember other things that he had a different point of view from a passenger standpoint.
Well, I think, Bill, that the trip probably made a greater impression on me because in your career as a professional railroader, you rode many inspection trains, and this was your work. For me,
How does it get started? Because I know go back to, because there's the way I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, the original plan was not to have Amtrak run. Is that?
that's right. So I'll go back.
Tell us a little bit about your background and then get to the.
I'm a native of the Lackawanna Valley. I grew up in Dunmore. My family has had, since 1938, a summer house in Tobyhanna. So in Dunmore, I lived a half a block from the Erie Scranton branch. It was still steam powered in my early memories. The Tobyhanna, the only thing to do in Tobyhanna is watch trains, as Bill might remember. And that was the height of the grade that was mentioned earlier. So these were the excitements of my early life. It crystallized for me on June 6, 1953, when an uncle of mine knew some of the train crews in the Scranton yard, and I was brought down there to ride 080 number 232 that day. It was the last steam engine working in Scranton, and according to Tabor, on July 13th, 1953, was the last Lackawanna steam engine in service. So that made a big impression on me. It only heightened my interest in trains. The earliest memory I have is getting on number 26 at Tobyhanna in what I believe was June 1951, and it was still steam powered at that time, which was a thrill for me because I remember my father hoisting me up and saying, "Look, a steam engine." My father, his father had been employed by the Lackawanna Railroad, later went into the insurance business, but my father had a fondness for steam engines. So we were driving along and he saw smoke in the distance. He'd pull off the road and watch the train go by. However, if it was a diesel, we'd just keep going. So I guess that was my early interest in trains. Continued on through high school. I mean, being in Tobyhanna, I was a frequent rider to Scranton during the summer. You had to go to a dental appointment or see the doctor, even to get a haircut. Most of the time, the barber in Tobyhanna, the military base, you just take off all your hair. That was that was the haircut. But as you got older, as an adolescent, you wanted the girls to notice you, so you pluck down the $1.25 round trip midweek fare and ride down to Scranton and come back on number 44, which used to be the milk train when milk was handled, but by that time it was mail and express with a rider coach like the number 47 had. Those trains lasted until March of '64 somehow. They were real anachronisms. So, you know, years went by. I love trains. I got a ride to Chicago in '61 on the Erie Lackawanna. Well, it was on the Lake Cities going out, the Erie Lackawanna Limited coming back on the Erie side, and you know, I grew, having been exposed to both the Erie and the Lackawanna, to love the Erie Lackawanna Railroad. You know, because that was my Erie experience in Dunmore and my Lackawanna experience at Tobyhanna put into one. And I was just sure it was going to work. Man, I bought stock in it. Still have the shares today. They were converted over eventually into Norfolk Southern shares. Got 10 shares for less than $100. And now I have 54 NS shares from that money. And I don't know what they're trading at right now, but it's considerably more than $100. 54 shares of NS. So I was interested. I read the annual reports every year. I communicated with anybody I knew who worked on the railroad. The closest I came to working for them was I attended just after I'd finished law school. I recollected incorrectly. I'd taken the bar exam. I went to a wedding in Pittsburgh, and there were a lot of people from Scranton at the wedding, and one of them on the groom's side, who I was there for, was Ray Carroll, who was the Director of Labor Relations in Cleveland. And he said, I want you to come out and take you on as a staff attorney in the Labor Department, the Erie Lackawanna. It was very tempting to me, but our family were cigar makers. Jerry, I don't see that you have any Perotti cigars on hand here, you know, but that's what we made from 1912 until we sold the business to an Italian company in 2015. And so I kept my interest in railroads up, though, and you know, my father always told me, you know, volunteer for things you're interested in, not just because they'll raise your social standing in the community, but because you can actually contribute something. So I was contacted by a gentleman named Dick Marshall, who through former Governor William Scranton and Congressman Joseph McDade was named the chair of the Railroad Task Force for the Northeast region of Pennsylvania. And our job at the same USRA reports that Bill were talking about, as soon as we got the preliminary system plan, our major strategy to save our rail system was to get the Chessie system to take over the Erie Lackawanna east of Ohio. And we had labor representatives on our group, we had community leaders. We thought that would be the way to save the most railroad jobs, and more importantly, the most jobs of industry served by the Erie Lackawanna. It was, you know, there was no doubt that the Jersey Central and Lehigh Valley, the Reading and the Penn Central were going to go into an entity. The word Conrail hadn't really come up at that point. So I remember, you know, meeting with Mr. Maxwell and, you know, hoping this was going to happen, and then all of a sudden our one solvent railroad was the only one left to compete with Conrail, the Delaware and Hudson. So, you know, because the Delaware and Hudson operated through our area, you know, we watched out for their interests to remain in business, because we were always taught that you wanted to have two connections, you know, and the Staggers Act really made that come into play. You know, our focus was on preserving the rail service. So we watched the situation develop into, okay, Erie Lackawanna is in, I'll use the word Conrail now, And it only happened weeks before the April 1st date Bill mentioned that they officially were in. So what's going to happen now? And they were obligated for 2 years by virtue of the final system plan to operate both the Erie side and the Lackawanna side between Binghamton and New Jersey. So we watched that carefully, and that had, as people familiar, and I know the audience, there were a lot of familiarity with when the Erie, as Bill mentioned, when they took over, a lot of the Lackawanna through freights were routed over the Port Jervis side. However, there was a later change in the 70s under Maxwell, where that much of that traffic went back to the Scranton side, and the Port Jervis side was single track for a large area going up to Binghamton. So at the time on Conrail Day, there were still 10 through freights going through Scranton in each direction of the Erie Lackawanna. Now, correct me, Bill, if I have that number wrong, but that's what I recollect. Within days, that went down to about 3 trains in each direction. And
When is that it cuts back to 3, roughly?
Over the course of maybe 6 weeks
From
April 1st.
Oh, right after the
Conrail
Day
took off.
Oh, okay.
So, we didn't want to see that happen, and we started watching carefully, how long they would continue to provide service over the entire line to New Jersey, and we figured there was some decent business at Pocono Summit. Chrysler had a distribution center there from automobile production in the Midwest. Portland received coal trains via Scranton, and the Tobyhanna Army Base, at least during the Vietnam War, was really taking a considerable amount of traffic. But once the war ended in '75, it fell down to a handful of cars a month. So we were concerned because we didn't have coal traffic anymore, and that was, the USRA planners took that into account. I remember one prediction, Bill, was that the entire area of the task force for the Northeast region, the USRA predicted would only produce 12,500 cars of freight a year, and they would need no more than 125 rail employees to service those 22 counties. I'll give you the numbers today later, but they were off. And it came down to December of '78. The last through intermodal train went east, and all of a sudden the signal system was off, which guided the train movements over the Scranton division. I'll call for whatever term it was used then. And
so that's the end of 1978,
right?
Basically,
December 18th,
yeah,
1978.
So we knew then that this is serious.
Yeah, this is
serious.
Yeah.
And then, we got a report about the change in how to access what we called the New Jersey Cut-Off. Happened in April. So we were aware of things, and then someone came into possession of a Conrail map that showed the primary access to Scranton was going to be off the Lehigh Valley Railroad at Pittston Junction, and then up the Bloomsburg line into Scranton. And we said, there goes both the Binghamton side and the New York side, the New Jersey side of the railroad as a through route. So that didn't please us. I mean, we were trying to find ways to preserve that as a through route. And we didn't know if Conrail would be around forever. They were losing hundreds of millions of dollars, taxpayers' dollars, each year at that time. And you made a spectacular turnaround into a profitable business. But it hadn't happened in 1979. So they were politically vulnerable. Congress and people like Governor Scranton had stature in the Republican Party. And, Joe McDade, said, well, what do we need to do to see if we can keep the cutoff? And we said, well, we'll come up with something.
This is Congressman Joe.
So,
Day.
right. So Dick Marshall and I sat down, and this was in, I'm going to say March of '79. How can we keep them from tearing up the tracks? Yeah. We'll ask to have a passenger train run from Scranton to Hoboken. So how do we do that? I said, well, New Jersey Transit's our best bet. They run at that time from Dover east into Hoboken, and
Well, let me say that, because I think, isn't Conrail running that at that point, or is it New Jersey Department of Transportation? Because New Jersey Transit comes in at 83 rail operations.
yeah. Well,
So I think it's something having to do with the government of the state of
New
New Jersey.
Jersey was subsidizing it, and I believe the new equipment that came online was that they were the owners of it.
I believe so.
So and they had some degree of discretion about where they could run in New Jersey, and well, Conrail operated the service, I think, to the end of '79 or mid '79.
I can't remember.
It was a time of transition, though.
Right.
So
Right.
so Chuck, it was things were moving, right?
But there's some entity in New Jersey that you're somehow dealing with to try to convince them to run
but
a
it
train.
wasn't New Jersey DOT. It was Jersey Transit, actually. It was in Newark, and we got an appointment to see Mr. Bill Herkner, who was a fine gentleman. He
We have a photo of him with Bob Yanissi we can show.
yeah.
The two of them on that.
Yeah, they. I was joined on that visit by Ray Baxter, and I was, for the purpose of the visit of establishing the passenger service, I was representing Lackawanna County, and Ray, who is a Jersey City police officer, he had been a railroad bull before that for like the Lehigh Valley, the Erie, and the Jersey Central, down there in Jersey. See, he came with me, and he brought a certain presence to it. He used to carry his gun in his. So
this is before the rail authorities exist, is it not?
Oh yes, this is
Okay.
long before.
Okay, so
You're talking about 4 years before there are any rail authorities. We go into Bill Herkner's office, and we had with us Paul Hart, who was a promoter through the Keystone Alliance of Railroad Passengers, which was a state organization trying to get passenger service. So he was the local chapter rep in northeastern Pennsylvania, and he came with us on this visit. And we had engaged the services of Edson Tennyson to draw us up a schedule. He was out of a job politically because he had been in the Shapp administration, and now we had the Thornburg administration. And he did some consulting work for us, and he drew up putative schedules and fare things and whatnot. So we brought this down to Newark, and it was a Friday afternoon, and we were told we'd have an hour of Mr. Herkner's time. Within 45 minutes, he'd committed to give us a train on Friday night that would complete its suburban schedule, go west of Scranton, return to Hoboken on Saturday morning to take day trippers to New York and then come back. So
he was committing to, I'll say, service, or just one train at this point? What was
no,
he?
yeah, one train on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays only.
But it would be an
But it'd be
actual,
a year-round thing.
it would be a service, okay.
Right, and the rationale to that was that Scranton was always an important city for the DL&W passenger service, and that the Pocono resorts, which had been somnambulant for much of the late '60s and early '70s, were finally starting to revive a little bit, and that we could, get riders going to them, like the train loads that used to come up in the early '60s to Pocono Summit and Cresco. So So he was very enthusiastic. He kept throwing things at us like, you should run this by the Morrison Essex. There's many more people there who want to go up to the mountains. It was a very good discussion. And he said, he said, I assume on Sunday you're going to run back Sunday night. I said, that's right. He said, just make sure that train's back here so I can use it for Monday's rush hour. Well, this was like, what? We got into the car. We drove up 280, and nobody said a word until we got on 80. And we looked at each other and said, we have a train. What? We have a train. So that set in motion a whole host of things. We informed PennDOT, that we were going to be asking them to help subsidize this train, and we had to take it under advisement. They said, and we went to our county commissioners, and we had worked out a funding schedule that was moderate, and they all agreed to it. So PennDOT got back to us and said, Governor Thornburg's Secretary of Transportation, his PhD was in road pavement. And he supposedly said, we can't have an out-of-state secretary directing services such as that in the Commonwealth. And he said, I believe there's bus service between Scranton and New York. That should suffice. So we never had PennDOT's full endorsement on this. But some other things came into play. And I'll just say 79 was not a great year for Amtrak. After those ridership spurts during the fuel oil crises of the 70s, things had leveled off. And the Carter administration, well, they were good to the freight railroads in many ways by helping and deregulate them. Many Amtrak passenger routes were discontinued in 1979. Among them were the National Limit, which was the New York to St. Louis to Kansas City train that ran over the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad to Pittsburgh, and then took the line to St. Louis through Dayton, Columbus and Dayton, and then the Missouri Pacific line to Kansas City. So that train was ill run. It was perpetually late. It was the direct opposite of our lake cities, which was a first-class operation until the end. The National Limited, I had a friend who lived in Lewistown, and I'd say, how late was it today? He'd say 12 hours late. And one day, I said, how was it today? He said, it was on time. And he said, I couldn't believe it. I went to the tower and asked the operator, and he said, oh, that was yesterday's train that was coming through. So the National Limited was discontinued, and that left Pennsylvania with only one cross-state train, and that was the Broadway Limited, which made, it was limited. It didn't make all the stops, and its service hours were set up to be a New York to Chicago express. And so the government of Pennsylvania the Republican government heard from the Republican areas of Pennsylvania, those communities primarily between Paoli and Pittsburgh, that they needed another train. And in the meantime, the highway department was completely redo Highway 22 from Altoona to Pittsburgh. So they put in, and then they had our request. So they put in a request to Amtrak for 3 service routes. Two actually came to fruition. The Pennsylvanian was launched in the spring of 1980. That originally was the Philadelphia to Pittsburgh train, then extended to New York, and it's still running today. The second one was supposed to be temporary. Until the highway was fixed, they were going to run this Altoona, Johnstown, Pittsburgh train on like a commuter schedule. But that only lasted as long as the Highway 22 reconstruction happened. Then it was our request. Now, I was told that when PennDOT talked to Amtrak about this, there was no equipment for it. So I was dispatched to Beech Grove, the Amtrak car shop outside of Indianapolis, and I was told to go out there and pick out 7 or 8 potential cars for a low cost restoration. You know, pick out 2 coaches or 3 coaches in some sort of a buffet lounge, and don't pick a dome because we can't get under the wires on the M&E. Well, it turned out, you know, I was picking the pretty ones, not the good ones. So I hired a car inspector named Stevenson, and he went out, and none of my cars could pass even the, you know, with a minor overhaul. They were all dead ducks. But he did find what I was looking for, and I reported that to Harrisburg.
So this would have been for what, Hoboken, Scranton,
Right.
on some sort of
Right.
scheduled with Amtrak.
With the Amtrak. And Amtrak had indicated that they would probably run a daily train as opposed to this jumbled holiday service that we were talking about really as an expedient, because New Jersey Transit had the cars, they weren't being used on the weekends, and you know, and that would be enough service to prevent the line from being taken up. So
this would have been what, 1 train in each direction a day, or how would that work?
yeah, they would have probably, but when they did start up lines like this in many other locales, they'd have, you know, the smaller locale with a 7 a.m. departure into the bigger locale, generally about 3 hours apart, and then they would have a 5 or 5:30 departure back to the smaller locale.
So
You know,
that would have
assuming that people wanted to go to the big locale in greater numbers than the other way.
So it would have left like 7 o'clock in the morning and from Scranton, and
Right.
5 or 5:30 in the evening from Hoboken.
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
So that was the general parameter. Now, Amtrak was hurting though, because they had been, you know, their budget was cut along with having to cut all these trains. I mean, some of them were really, you know, the North Coast Hiawatha was cut. You know, everything except the, you know, all the ones that were kind of shaky, except the Cardinal, which had strong political support from West Virginia, were cut. Now this was coming from, not, you know, Amtrak was hearing this from Congressman McDade directly. He was, at that time, he was probably the 4th ranking Republican congressman in the House. They didn't control the House of Representatives, but he had access to a lot of deal making, including Steamtown eventually. You know.
Well, he represented Scranton,
Yeah.
the Scranton area.
And he was very good at it. So Dick Marshall, who I had referenced earlier, was a student at Notre Dame with him back in the late 40s and early 50s. That's how he knew him. And Marshall was in the railroad business. He was a railroad supply guy, car swap, everything else. But you know how to make deals. Both of them did. And
So we have this proposal for a train in each direction, regular service. So this is now replacing what would have been like you say like a New Jersey Transit or New Jersey base type of operation, which Bill Herkner was proposing.
And we were all in favor of that because, you know, we would have been.
Where did these?
Our
stations were you going to be stopping at? Did you ever
yeah,
have that?
see, well, that really tied up most. Bill Herkner referred to an express train from Dover to Hoboken, but even an express train would stop at more than the traditional stops, which were Morristown, Summit, Brick Church, and Newark. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, that'll be
A commuter train would still be stopping at maybe Convent Station. I don't know which ones, but Chatham, you know, for sure. So they would have, you know, each one of those stops makes a big difference in the timing because they all nick you on the way up. So we were happy if they just went back to where the Erie Lackawanna and the DL&W were stopping in New Jersey, which included Blairstown too.
And then some stops in Pennsylvania as well, I presume.
Yeah, if I knew Jerry was up here, we would have stopped here too. So,
Johmsonburg.
so the, you know, that was the all that commotion I just talked about is what set this November 13th, 1979 train in motion. I have to bring up some things about it that troubled me right from the start. One was there would be no notification of the press or any information given out about this train. And we were told that if that was leaked, the project was over from the start. And you know, that's what we had to live by. I didn't have the date, but I had the Central High School band ready to be at the Scranton station to meet the train. Red, white, and blue banners out all over the place, but all that was not permitted on Conrail property. So I had, you know, when the I
So
got
who put this condition onto this whole running of the train? Was that Conrail? It wasn't Amtrak, was it? Or was it?
I wasn't at the top of our organization. We had to defer to PennDOT, you know, and
So who? I'm trying to get at who was putting the kibosh on the.
it was our understanding that the Secretary of Transportation of Pennsylvania at that time, Bryan, the Undersecretary for Rail and Local Area Transportation, Don Bryan, received this from PennDOT, that there was to be no publicity about this train. And, you know, guys like Tom Nemeth and the late Jim Boyd would tell you that was the case. They only found out about it just before it left. I didn't leak it. I didn't leak it to anybody, though.
Yeah, Jim Boyd apparently he apparently was the way I remember he was a skeptic that it was actually going to run at all, and he had planned to be at the Paulinsko Viaduct to get a shot, and he ended up meeting it I think at Cresco because he finally got word that it was running, but it was how he found out I don't really know, but it was like through the grapevine probably, but. There were people along the route, obviously, so word did get out.
Yeah, I saw people at Tobyhanna, which I didn't expect to see out there shooting it. But it was.
Can you imagine if they'd been allowed to advertise what that might have been, how much different that might have been?
Yeah, and you know, I could understand the railroad's viewpoint too. I mean, they didn't want to turn this into a circus, and you know,
But I mean, from a political standpoint, you would have wanted a circus.
Oh yeah, we definitely we wanted to generate public enthusiasm for this, and we wanted to be part of the Amtrak National Network. You know, so you know, what started out as a ploy to keep the tracks in place actually started gathering support through the community as each of these stages I just talked about, you know, started to develop. And you know, one guy said to me, well, I guess they wouldn't send you to Indianapolis unless it was for real. I said, well, that would help make it real, you know. So we really did hope by the time of November 13th that we might, you know, find out. But Conrail was going to be our partner. I mean, it's much different now that there's so many segmented ownerships over that route. You know, Conrail was the railroad for us, right? Like, and we certainly didn't want to antagonize Conrail by trying to overturn their judgment about the publicity part of it.
Which, you know, makes me wonder because of what we know happens after all of this takes place, that you would think that Conrail was somehow behind maybe the PennDOT thing. I'm just speculating now. But I kind of smell Conrail being in there someplace.
Well, Conrail was very important to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The headquarters are there, the large locomotive shop are there, several enormous yards like Enola and Conway were there, and the still strong steel industries were serviced by Conrail. I mean, you know, so northeastern Pennsylvania would not be foremost in their minds because Conrail was, especially being headquartered in Philadelphia, was very important to the political members of both parties, no matter who was coming. Yep.
So now, okay, this train. At what point do you find out? I mean, both of you now. When do you find out that it's official? This train is running.
I found out about, I'm going to say 2 days before, Bill.
Yeah, it was less than a week.
So you know, if you know officially it's going to run. The rest of the world, they don't know because you guys have been sworn to silence.
Well, I needed to get a ride down.
That was my next
Yeah.
question. How did you get to? Because it's starting in Hoboken. There's no service, so you have to get to Hoboken somehow.
Well, I was bringing the PennDOT undersecretary with me too. I met him at Dover, and we decided because the other portion of the railroad was in service, that we wouldn't get on until Dover.
Oh, so you only had to go to Dover. Okay.
Right. So we came into Dover, and they came in, with the platform car being shoved up. We got on and went through the stuff at Fort Morris to get turned around the right way, and and we proceeded over the cutoff. It was I would say it was an amicable situation on the car.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody had their jobs to do. We respected what the other side had, and they respected why we were there.
When did you get on, Bill? Or did you?
Hoboken.
You got on Hoboken. So you ride the train west now. Who's on this train? I mean, you guys. You've talked, of course. Was Bill Herkner there?
Yeah, Bill Herkner was on it, and
Bob Yancey, of course.
And
Well, of
Bob
course, Bob.
Yancey.
These guys. We got pictures of them behind the train.
It's on the Tennyson report, the people who were on board.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Right here.
yeah, Al Krzyzewski, the Scranton Division engineer, was on it, I believe. Jim Larson was definitely on it. You remember that, Bill?
Mm-hmm.
Assistant Vice President of Contracts. That's with Amtrak.
Right.
A.L. Clark, Director, Stations and Operations. These are all Amtrak people. R.K. Myers, John Curtin or Certain, I can't remember. Carton, T.J. Gillespie.
Yes, he was a graduate of the University of Scranton in 1969, and he later became a vice president. He's another one who's still alive, I'm quite certain.
And for Conrail, Bob Downing, A.F. Krzyzewski.
Al Grzyzewski.
Right, yeah.
A.F. Krzyzewski, okay. Regional passenger engineer. William H. Shepard,
Yeah.
You were supervisor of consolidation projects at that point.
Actually, they got the title wrong.
So what was your actual title?
It wasn't that. I'm trying to see what my notes say. It was coordinator of transportation or something like that.
Okay. For PennDOT, Bill or William Polk,
Right,
from Monroe County, E.L. Tennyson,
right,
and for Lackawanna County, Dominic Keating.
right.
So that's the roster of people.
And Mike Wikman, what's his name, Leslie?
No,
he was on the engines.
he was on the engine, so there might be the guys on the engine.
Yeah, Tennyson wrote that report. He probably didn't meet him in the car.
He probably didn't. So that's a dog that wasn't barking.
So the train, runs. It makes it. I know it makes a couple of stops because there's the. Aside from the winding
Took
of
him
the
up
train,
to Dover.
right? So you had to at least stop at Dover. I saw the train at South Orange. I'm in college at that point, and I'm sitting in my den, and I'm eating breakfast, and I hear I'll say a weird horn, a horn that I did not recognize for Mountain Station. You're talking about Mountain Station because I've lived about a quarter mile west of Mountain Station. My house, which I just visited a few days ago, is right next to the tracks. So I hear this, what the heck is that? Amtrak. I saw the Amtrak, saw the train go past. And for years I had no idea what it was for. It was only much later that I found out about it. So all of us that are here, with the exception of the Larissa, were either on the train or saw the train. Larissa has an excuse because it was 18 years before she was born. But so the train makes a stop at Dover. It stops in the Pequest Foe where we get the photo with Bill Herkner and Bob Yancey.
Remember that?
It stops at East Stroudsburg.
I thought we make a stop in the water gap to look at
I
some
can't
stuff.
remember.
Yeah, I know we made.
I'll take a look at my photos, but
Yeah,
I can't remember that.
Yeah, I know.
And then Scranton, of course. I don't know if you stopped anywhere in between.
I think
but
we stopped somewhere between Tobyhanna and Gouldsboro,
I can't remember.
and
So what's the chatter like on the train, if you can recall? I know we're asking 44 years ago what you guys might have been talking about, but any kind of general type of impressions.
There were quite a few people who had not been over the route before, particularly the Amtrak people. So they were asking a lot of questions, and fortunately, between the rest of us, we were able to ask them. Some of them were technical questions, some of them about the populations of the areas we were going through.
And I wrote a book in 1974 which had the whole line, all down to the signals and everything
Did
else.
you have that with you by any chance?
Of course I did.
Ah.
So
there you go.
I'm on board, and I have the book. People knew about the book, and if there was any question about this or that, I had it. We also had diagrams, track diagrams that Conrail had, and they're fairly large and cumbersome to deal with, but we had them on board that Al Grzeski brought along. But I had this as well.
So what? Of course, the railroad. We talked about the cutoff in particular, but the cutoff had been out of service, so you're not going along at 70 miles an hour. You're going at some restricted speed.
I think we could have gone at 59.
Yeah, we weren't going at restricted speed.
But
So you okay?
We weren't going that slow, but I forget
we had
what
an
what it
Amtrak
was.
F40 pulling the train, and just an Amfleet coach and the A10,000 office car. I mean, so there was not.
Was there any food on board?
Yes, we had a steward who made delicious sandwiches, and we had sodas. I think there was coffee available. One thing, I knew we were in big trouble. Now, Ed Tennyson, very smart man, and a very opinionated man, and Jim Larson, a very smart man, who was Ed was more of a theoretical railroader. He used his scholarly abilities to idealize railroads as to what they could be. Jim was a practical railroader. He'd been a telegrapher on the Chicago Northwestern, and came up through the ranks. And they started having words with each other. Now we figured these are two people who are both on what I'll call our side, as opposed to the Conrail side. And they started making threatening moves to each other, and there was a little push, and they're yelling at each other. And Tennyson went berserk. Do you remember that, Bill?
Vaguely.
I had to put him in an arm lock and bring him back to one of the bedrooms in the office.
There was drama
Yeah.
on the train.
Which
But they were-
which was
but
the
it
last thing
wasn't-
you needed.
Right, but it wasn't the Conrail people
No,
who were
we-
causing the drama.
We were totally cool, but
Yeah.
but there was a lot of static on the other side.
So I saw several of the Conrail people. I'm trying to gauge what are they thinking, and they were just looking at each other and going, So
We were the hosts.
for a food fight between children. It was. We made a stop at East Stroudsburg, and one of the passionate members of the Northeast Task Force ran the International Boiler Works there. And he was an Irish American. And yeah, I got off the train and, what's going on? I said, well, it would be all right if we weren't fighting among ourselves so much. He said, I'm getting out of here. The only fight I don't like is the one I miss. You know, so we calmed down going into Scranton. Bill will tell you about the interesting route back, the train.
Because the train doesn't go back
doesn't
from
come back
Wilkes
over
Kane.
Lackawanna.
It went down on the Lehigh Valley.
Uh-huh.
And it didn't have to reverse directions. I think it came right around
Yeah, but it had to do a little Y move there at Pittston
Junction, right.
So where does it end up when it's
It went back to Philly.
going back to Philadelphia? Okay.
I think it went down to Bethlehem and then went down from there.
Yeah.
So here this train runs. There's a little bit of a stir, but and I'm not talking about the stir on board, but at least some people became aware of it. What comes out of it? Obviously, we know the answer is that nothing tangible comes out. But this, I think, and actually, I said preceding this, even leading up to the train, the circumstances were becoming obvious that the line is in danger. This is really the beginning of the effort to, well, I'll say save the line, but ultimately to reactivate it. But what, at that point, 1979, or let's say going into 1980, if it goes that far, what comes out of this, or at least what appears to maybe
quickly summarize, because I've been rambling on too much, what my involvement was after that point. You know, we couldn't, I couldn't report back to the political figures and say this was a rosy thing and everything's going forward. And indeed, it wasn't. You know, PennDOT had strong misgivings. They blamed that Amtrak didn't want to set up a commissary at Hoboken, all these nitpicking excuses why the train shouldn't run. Okay, so we knew at some point the request for the train was going to be withdrawn by PennDOT. And we tried another direction, which I'm sure Bill was aware of what was happening on this one. The Delaware and Hudson had tough operating conditions over its North Penn division, up over the Ararat grade, which would have stood out in that chart if they were included. And I joined an effort for them to purchase the Taylor to Binghamton line, and I was included in with the D&H management in an advisory, like PR capacity. A lot of high rail trips before the acquisition, and we had a spectacular grand opening of the line on Columbus Day weekend in 1980, and we tried to go to the next step after that, which was to get the line to New Jersey. And my last trip by rail over the cutoff wasn't on the 13th of November 1979. It was later on two D&H high rail cars where we ran from Scranton to we might have only gone to Port Morris. Were you aware that we were?
No, but
Peeking
that makes sense.
Yeah.
I just don't know where you would have gotten
Yeah,
off
we
there.
That would have been an active railroad at that point. I mean, beyond
Well, yeah.
Port Morris.
Probably got off in the yard.
Yeah, we got off in the yard and we drove back by highway to Scranton. We stopped for sodas somewhere. And it might have. Could we have walked over to the store from the high rail cars from here?
It's a half-mile walk.
Well, okay.
There was a store
It wasn't-
in Greendale right next
Okay,
door.
that's probably where we stopped.
Probably
then.
Greendale. That's probably good. Right next to the station.
Right.
And
I remember
there
that
was
place.
a passing sign
right there.
So it was a hot summer afternoon. We stopped there. Howard Hans was our group leader on that trip. We tried everything to convince him. I remember going to President McKenna myself and at a meeting saying, "Sir, do you realize that if you don't explore this opportunity, it will probably foreclose any time that you'll have your own track into Metro New York. And he said, we totally understand that, but we don't have the money to do it. And he was speaking candidly. So, the project from that point on, I am not an authority on. I had, our cigar making business was having problems, and there were many members of our family who wanted to get out of it entirely. And my uncle and I made what was almost a last-ditch effort to save our manufacturing capability and continue to put our goods on the market. So after that point, I had to devote all my energy to that and bank the fires on the railroad stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is that after, and what we're talking about, what, 1980-ish, 1981?
Well, yeah, in the 19...
Because it's clear that...
In the 1982. Yeah.
Because and 1982, I think, is if... and Bill, you can correct me if I'm wrong, certainly. That's when the official abandonment, I think, takes place in 92?
I don't know.
I think so. I want to say it, but officially, although it's clear that that's where it's all going, that that's the plan. At least Scranton east to Port Morris, 88 miles, and that's where at some point the rail authorities. I think Monroe County. I don't know. I think Monroe is the first one. Monroe County.
They formed first, but they didn't own track first. That was what happened. They formed a rail authority, but they didn't actually own any track, and they predated Lackawanna's formation. So, it's interesting that the staff for Lackawanna County, now Pennsylvania Northeast Regional Rail Authority, has been Larry Malsky and Charlene Doyle. Larry hired on in '84 and Charlene in '85 as a temporary government worker. And they've been the whole staff of this organization for this incredible period of time.
But of course you sit on the rail authority now, the combined rail authority, I'll say.
One point, we've been talking, of course, about the cutoff, but I have another date I'll throw out.
Sure.
That was May 15th of 1979. That was the last time that's when the line was last operated between Mount Pocono and Gravel Place. So that was another segment that became inactive. And the reason for that was the freight traffic was rerouted via the Vancouver Portland branch instead. So you had the cutoff with no business, and then you had from Mount Pocono to Gravel Place, no business.
Right.
Just so you know, to see the bigger picture here.
Understood.
Yeah,
Now, there was reason to go to Mount Pocono. There's an auto facility there, but that closed too.
It was moved to New Jersey, I believe. Right?
Yes, it did.
Yeah, and I remember talking to, in fact, one of our interviews with Larry Malsky, and he intimated that Conrail had more or less encouraged, I think might have been the word he used, the Chrysler people to move, or to at least give them the sense that the writing was on the wall that the line is going to be is going to be abandoned, and that they would be wise to move on, something along those lines.
I heard different stories, but
Yeah, and the thing is, I guess I don't know that we want to really discuss what happens next, because we know that the track will come up in New Jersey between Port Morris and
there were last-ditch efforts to save it that you're aware of, Chuck, but I can't speak directly to any of them because I wasn't involved.
We've covered this in previous episodes, and the thing is that I don't want to minimize, because there's a lot of effort put into it, and I know some people are still to this day angry about the fact that they weren't able to make a deal basically with Conrail. The question I have, though, and since you're with Conrail at the time, what if Conrail were really interested in keeping, let's say, the Lackawanna side and let's say even the Erie side, which we know they weren't, but let's say for the sake of argument, what would they have to have done? Could they have made that work, or do you think it was just basically destined to go the way it did, and they basically put it out of its misery, if you want to put it that way.
Well, when you look at this line, you have to take a look at it looking at it as part of a larger network. And there were so many other routing alternatives and things going on that you have to keep in mind. And for example, on the Erie side, you had the Ford Motor Company plant, which closed in, I think it was 1980. And you had New York State stepping up, helping to fund some of the track work on that side. And you know,
Right, that's
That was
well
a-
known that New York State really kept that line from
Yes.
the Port
The
Jervis
reason
line from being
Yeah.
the NYS&W runs with signals today is that very thing. They did it.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
That's the Mawa plant we're talking about
Right.
now. Right, in
Other
Ford.
things, and I know that you want to stay focused on the cutoff, but you need to take a step back and see things from a rail network standpoint. And for example, Mount Pocono, wonderful facility, but Conrail had all these automobile facilities at Tidewater, and you didn't have to brush the snow off the windshield as much as you did on top of the Poconos.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. That there are different schools of thought as to what was
Sure.
behind the. You can make an argument both ways that Conrail was basically doing what it had to do from a business perspective.
Yes.
But you can also make the argument that, yeah, but here they've inherited a say infrastructure or an asset
Yes.
that the American people, in a sense, are paying for, and now they're basically going to abandon it, and the whole corridor, and not even just, we're talking the Erie Lackawanna, much for the most part ceases to exist, at least as a Conrail entity, that they spin it off or they abandon it. That this has a great economic, a great detriment economically to those corridors.
Well, these problems that you're concerned about, they predate Conrail. For example, when the Erie Lackawanna came in, it was led by former Erie people, okay, who agreed to eliminate the Boonton line between Patterson Junction and around Garrett Mountain so that I-80, Interstate 80, could be built. Instead, the freight trains were rerouted via the Greenwood Lake branch and over a pretty stiff grade at Great Notch. Okay? That wasn't a big concern to the Erie guys because in their view, the traffic should be moving via the former Erie anyway.
And it would be for quite some time.
Yes, it would be. And then this continued because as years passed, now they stripped out the double track that ran between Lincoln Park and up toward Denville, and so the Boone line became single track there. And you say, well, why is that a problem? Well, there was an internal study that was done by the Erie Lackawanna at one point that recommended that more freight trains run back on the Lackawanna side. The problem was that the Erie Lackawanna had just secured the UPS contract, and Croxton 99 wouldn't be leaving Jersey City's Croxton Yard until around 5 a.m., 5:30 in the morning. Well, guess what's going to happen? It's going to run via the Boonton line over Great Notch and face an onslaught of passenger trains with no way to get around them. So there was a series of decisions that predate Conrail, that go back to the Erie Lackawanna, where they were looking at things from a different standpoint, and they downgraded and portions of the Boonton line that was an outstanding freight route for a long time, and that's what Conrail inherited was that situation that was left to it by the Erie Lackawanna.
And that does come up, at least I understand from reading it from what was being said at the time, that when Conrail is looking at abandoning the line, that comes up. Garrett Mountain, for example, where you have basically, say, a high-speed freight route, which has now been traded in for, I'll say, a medium-speed commuter line where you're competing with commuter trains for track time, because just the way the railroad is set up.
Let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Between Mountain View, where the Erie crossed, and Secaucus, tell me how many grade crossings there are.
Going in which direction on the Greenwood Lake?
No, on the former Lackawanna.
I want to say 0.
How many do you think there are on the Greenwood Lake branch?
A lot.
Thank you. All right. So, and you had grades and things like that as well. The line was nowhere near what the Lackawanna line was. And the reason I'm a little harsh on this is, as a kid, I rode these lines. I had the opportunity to ride the Lackawanna line, and I rode the former Erie lines, and I can tell you that Lackawanna line was outstanding, and it was just amazing, and then to see it get stripped away over the years, it just was. When Conrail inherited, we didn't inherit something that was around, all those years before. It was just a shell of itself.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt that it would come back, that if we talk about the changes, Garrett Mountain particularly, that it comes back to haunt the Erie Lackawanna, and I guess you could say Conrail, but that's what they've inherited.
We inherited that. But
yeah, you can make that case in terms of that. Well, Conrail was justified. I'm gonna say middle of the road type of guy, but I'm thinking of it in a bigger picture of what the asset is that could be used for other purposes, not necessarily even freight. Because now, and this is where we would probably want to bring Jerry in, where we start talking about, we go into the 80s, late 80s, the line is abandoned and it's sort of like all hope is lost sort of thing. Steamtown comes into Scranton, and then there's the rebirth, I'll say, of the railroad down to the water gap.
Right.
And that keeps the whole possibility alive. I know we didn't even talk about like casinos, in Pennsylvania going back.
They didn't even have them in Jersey then.
But
maybe in '79 they started.
Yeah, well,
that
that played into it, and there's, I think it's been said that it might have played against Amtrak coming in. But when we get into the 80s, and then there's the effort through the 90s to acquire the Cut-Off, which in 2001 finally the line is in, the Cut-Off is in state hands in New Jersey. No tracks on it though, and there's no funding for tracks. We fast forward to 2011, and then the construction starts with money to go to Andover. And then, which is still, to this day, still in progress. We're another few years before even that's going to be completed, but at least it's going. And then in 2020 or 2021, Amtrak comes out with a map which puts Scranton service back on the radar, so to speak. And where we are right now is basically a waiting game for October, where the Federal Railroad Administration with Amtrak are going to be issuing I'll call it a priority list or a short list of corridors which would be eligible for future funding. Not the big funding, but at least sort of in a sense like musical chairs, a small
to do
number
all
of
these preliminary
which
things.
You can speak to, because the rail authority has been dealing with the folks at Amtrak.
Yeah, we've had a great relationship with them. We self-funded their look at our project. by paying them to come in and take us right off the bat as soon as the infrastructure bill passed. And they gladly did that. There have been over 100 applications for that money submitted to the FRA and or for that approval.
Which is
And-
almost 3 times as many as the corridors that Amtrak had originally identified.
However, many of them asked Amtrak to provide a similar service, but they were so besieged, they weren't able to meet the deadlines on it. And we were fortunate to get our project analyzed first, and we feel very definitely Amtrak has a nice opinion of what they want to do on it, where they project 2 trains in many cases on some of these routes. They project 3 round trips on the Penn Station to Hoboken, where time was went against us compared to the bus schedules. Where the projected time now is faster than practically all the bus schedules that exist, where it was consistently slower, and that's because of the speeds that we get coming over here. 110 is what they're looking for, and can't do that up on the Pennsylvania side.
Well, that's interesting because I-80 is 8 miles shorter than the cutoff.
Well, it's going to be 2 hours and 50 minutes from Scranton to Penn Station. The fastest the Lackawanna ever did it was 2 hours and 55 minutes in 1939 with the Streamline Pacific and 4 cars.
Oh.
But they couldn't continually maintain that schedule. And back then, a railroad, if it couldn't maintain its schedule, it changed the schedule to reality. And then it started running in 3 hours and 10 minutes. It was carted at 3:05 from Scranton to Hoboken. The big difference is that extra 25 to 30 minutes that it takes to get to Midtown Manhattan via the tubes, or the 63 bus, if that still runs. And now the train's going directly into Manhattan. So that 2 hour and 50 minute time, Franny and I went in to see the opera on a Sunday, took up 3.5 hours from Scranton. Lincoln Tunnel, 45 minutes at a great view of New York, but we weren't going anywhere. And
You still have to find parking.
yeah, and this is Mart's. Yeah, right. I mean, this is on a bus. Right?
Oh, this is on a bus. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, the buses are running into that same traffic as if we were in our car. But
That is the problem with buses. Yes.
right, so, I'm encouraged. We've had so many setbacks, and I say I haven't been involved in the project. I've certainly been involved in it. From the time I ran a tourist railroad between Tobyhanna and Cresco for 3 years back in the 90s, called it the Pocono Mountain Railroad. And we did it in cooperation with the DL. We had the outboard diesels. We had 6 heavyweight cars from Montreal, commuter cars, and they rode good around those curves up there. And we had a lounge car off the city of Los Angeles that's in bad condition now, but it was nice then. And it was one Ronald Reagan actually used when he was touting the Union Pacific passenger service. So, I mean, I did get, I did have, after work and on weekends, I had a railroad job, running that train. But, it only lasted for 3 years.
So when do you become involved with the rail authority?
It was after that. It was after a change in governments in Lackawanna County. A new government came in. One of the backers of them in the election had been a strong opponent of the rail authority, and they were going to dissolve the rail authority. And
Which one?
offer
The
its-
Lackawanna?
The Lackawanna County Rail Authority. That would have marooned the Monroe to a very bad position because they had acquired the track to Analomink from Pocono Summit. They didn't have the track in downtown, in East Stroudsburg where the industries were. So that remained in first Conrail and then Norfolk Southern hands.
Chuck, there's some other things I wanted to leave with you. When you look at the rail routes today, in the context of equipment dimensions, we see double stacks running around and piggybacks and whatever. The Lackawanna route is constrained by the overhead wires used for the passenger trains.
Okay.
Used to be 3,000 volts DC. I don't know what the voltage is now.
25,000.
It's AC. From what I understand, the air gap has to be increased. And so that's another concern that some other routes just don't have.
Well, in terms of freight, but I know that the issue of freight has come up, and there's some, I would say, opponents who say, well, you're going to run freight trains, and the likelihood, in my opinion, and I've asked these questions of others, not, we're bringing it up, but you're bringing it up again, which is a, very interesting point. The railroaders I've talked to, I think of Bob Bars and John Sabatka, to name a couple, said no chance that the chance for freight returning to this line is probably
Where do you go
Yeah.
with it, right? I mean, that's
right, and as I say, piggybacks, where they've become, now we're into double stack containers. We have these, high cubes running around, and the thing is that the Erie Lackawanna had a problem running freight trains on the Morristown line. They used to run a train out of Hoboken, a freight train, and drop the cars off at the Morristown and Erie Railroad. Couldn't do that anymore because they couldn't get through Roosevelt Avenue due to the overhead wire issues. And these problems have intensified over the years, and so that's another factor that weighs against reusing the cutoff to run through freight trains, because the connecting lines in Jersey just don't have the clearances to handle the freights. And I just wanted to make mention of that.
And the thing is
so
that
you're aware of it.
And the thing is that freight, I think, at that point in time, we were talking about late 70s, early 80s,
Yeah.
would have been, in a sense, I'll say, a bridge to keeping the line alive, which it did. It ended up being in Pennsylvania,
definitely.
because that was the service there. I mean, basically had to start from scratch to bring everything back that basically had gone basic. Essentially, the whole had been shut down. But theoretically, if there would have been some kind of freight operation, the line wouldn't have abandoned. It's water under the bridge. I mean, obviously it was abandoned, and we've had to go through this arduous process of trying to bring the whole thing back. And at this point, pinning our hopes on Amtrak doing it from Andover west. I mean, obviously everything else would be New Jersey Transit east of there, but if Amtrak weren't coming in, I don't know what we would be doing. But the thing is, that's just the situation we're in at this point. But yeah, I mean, freight was considered to be a way of maintaining the line. Now, we talked about passenger service, but it seems as if that was not in the cards.
To go back to the D&H exploration of this, their primary interest at the time of those high rail trips was Port Morris Yard as an intermodal loading point.
Yes.
They weren't thinking about going to Croxton or anywhere else.
But could we get double stacks through Roosevelt Tunnel?
Not the way it is now.
Thank you.
And I don't think there's any plan for that.
No,
I mean,
but I'm just saying that these things were fine for the Lackawanna, but things over time have grown up and higher, and they have to be considered. That's all.
and often it comes down to timing, because if, for example, had there been, let's say, some kind of segue between the different operations where there would have been continuous service, the line may not have been abandoned, but because of the way things worked out, it was. I mean, it just, these are the cards we're dealt. I know we can go over all the what ifs types of thing, but these are the cards we've been dealt.
Right.
Right, and that's a very good point Bill makes, because, you know, certainly a low-level route like the Hoosick Tunnel route would be one that any railroad would be looking to replace. As like CSX and NS have worked out in New England now, you know,
Right.
by routing that train through the Boston and Albany line to avoid the Hoosick Tunnel.
Now you have a very nice schematic there behind you, Bill, which we were looking at earlier, and it shows or compares the different railroads out of New York City, and you can see, I think, pretty dramatically that the Lackawanna had significant grades or mountains, if you want. It was a mountain railroad by definition, and that would have played into the certainly the costs. You know, aside from sidings or commuter traffic and such. I think the rule of thumb is, I think it's for every 0.1% increase in grade, it's 40% increase in motive power that's required.
And
So-
the Erie Lackawanna added another grade by eliminating the boot line to Patterson. They rerouted freight trains over Great Notch.
So
And there were no helpers around there to help them at that point. On the Poconos, there were.
So in terms of time and cost, it certainly didn't make sense. Now, from a passenger operation, it's a different story. I mean,
Absolutely.
and that's where I wanted to bring in Jerry to somehow
Jerry, have a seat, please.
You guys
roll in, and I guess we want to talk about essentially, and this is where your opinions come in. We're not. This is I want to say not facts, but we're to your opinions, because we have New Jersey Transit, who's going to be running to Andover, maybe 2026, 2027. Amtrak, we don't know, because it's a big question mark. It's not definite, but one has to figure it's going to be probably a couple years later at the earliest. They come in. What are your thoughts on that, or what is it? I mean, there's the local, because I know Jerry, you would know. I'll say sort of the local effects of such a thing, but even from I'll say the regional effect of having rail service that has been gone for 50 years now, 53 years at this point. It'll be closer to 60, or at least, you know. That. What do you think? What do you think the impact is, and how do you think it'll work? Do you think it'll do okay? What do you think is going to happen? I mean, this is just your opinion, so I just throw it in your laps, and what do you think?
Well, I think it's a very good idea. It's got a lot of promise. You have to get all these organizations together, you know, the Monroe County Rail Authority, Lackawanna, New Jersey Transit. If you run 3 round trips a day, you're going to do fine.
Would be better with more, obviously.
Yeah,
But
I mean, you can
to start out with, we're talking about 3 in each
Yeah,
direction.
you can start out with 2, but 3 is ideal. I use an example of Amtrak's service to Roanoke, Virginia. Roanoke for years never had passenger service. Now they put a train on in the morning and one coming back late at night from Penn Station, New York. And it's amazing how many people use that. And they got so busy they put another train on. It leaves Roanoke 1 o'clock in the afternoon, goes to New York, and I think one comes around 4 o'clock from New York. But a great success story. But you had to have Virginia, and all these agencies get together and say, hey, we want service. They build them a new station in Roanoke, a nice thing. It's a long platform, nothing fancy, but very functional. Get off, get on the train, a nice parking lot. Parking has a lot to do with patronage. The bigger the lot, the brighter it is, the more people you're going to get, because they want to get off and get on the train and get off. I had one time the Lackawanna schedule. I think I have it here. Excuse me a minute here. I figured it out the other day. I don't have it.
Well, what do you guys think? You know, what's your thoughts on this?
On what?
We're talking Amtrak. I mean, we can talk New Jersey Transit as well, but I
Yeah.
mean, you go back, both you gentlemen, of course, remember Erie Lackawanna. I mean, in the years that and so does Jerry, of course. But this is different, a little bit. You know, Amtrak is not Erie Lackawanna.
Yeah.
There's similarities, but what do you think?
Well, like I say, this old schedule here that we had out of Scranton, that left at 5:33, got to Blairstown at 7:06, Hoboken 8:45. Then they had one out of Scranton at 7:35, got into Blairstown at 9:11, and got into Hoboken at 10:35. And then they had the PB Snow, which is left Scranton at 3:20, went into Blairstown 4:57, and got to Hoboken at 6:30. So you had 2 morning trains and 1 afternoon train. That would be ideal for Amtrak. But you know, the train you have to get that train in under 3 hours. You don't want it any more than 3 hours. Like I said, 80 is what, 5 miles shorter, and you're competing with the Morse bus line. And they're aggressive.
So it's a different experience driving than it is riding in a train.
The train is, it can work. It can work, but it's you know, if you take the people when they want to go and bring them back when they want to come back, you're going to have a nice,
Since we're
nice train.
Since we're talking about passenger service, one thing I would like to mention is a lot of issues having to do with the Hudson River line capacity. Right now, that is stretched to the max.
Mm-hmm.
They're building the new Portal Bridge and the
Gateway
tunnels
tunnel.
and so forth. Introducing small trains from Scranton into the mix now, I think would be a struggle to sell. You want to, if you're going to be running trains through the Hudson River Tunnel, you want to make sure they're long, they have a lot of people on them. I was wondering whether we could have an initial start running these trains in and out of Hoboken like they used to be, rather than this start of service to Scranton isn't held hostage to the Hudson River Tunnel fixing up her. And I know that discussions haven't progressed to this point, but I see this as a hurdle to be dealt with. And I think that some consideration should be given to an alternative to, if you're going to push to get the Scranton service going, don't get yourself barricaded behind the Hudson River expansion. Maybe consider Hoboken as an interim terminal, and then
Hoboken worked fine for many, many years.
we take the path, yes.
Take the path. You know.
I would
63
I would
bucks,
say
you know.
there has been all of our discussions for a long time, up to the dawn of the infrastructure bill, and after this November 13th, 1979, Amtrak hasn't been part of this discussion. It was always New Jersey Transit. And because New Jersey Transit does not own that tunnel to Penn Station,
Thank you.
we were always directed toward Hoboken. And I would say, yes, if the choice is between not having the service and going to Hoboken, let it be Hoboken. However, Amtrak owns that access to New York.
Yes.
And they are the ones
Yes.
who are saying we should go in the Penn Station, and they are the owners of the tunnel. So,
They also put scheduled times as well. They've worked it
they've
out.
worked with New Jersey Transit on those times and on the trains going through the tunnel. And I appreciate what Bill's saying, but I really think we have an answer for that one, Bill.
Okay.
Is that we have,
That's good.
instead of being a tenant, we're on the owner's trains.
All right. Good. But I see these trains leaving Newark's Penn Station, 10, 11 cars long, double stacked
Yeah.
cars, jammed with people. What are you going to show up from Scranton with? 3 cars?
Well, I think there'll be six.
There'll be
Six?
six cars on the train.
They're just stressed out for line capacity going through, and I've been hearing about it, and I want to make sure that
The
that it's
punitive
considered.
schedules that they put out, Bill, actually they claim,
Okay.
took into account, like, we didn't have some ideal times in these punitive schedules. We didn't have like a 5:30 departure. It's pushed back to near 7 o'clock when
Okay.
there's
That has to be considered. That's all.
And in the future, when we get more tunnels or available tunnels,
Yes.
are you running? Oh, sorry. When we get more available tunnels, it will be hopefully a non-issue. But certainly, I think we're also talking about once you get west of Port Morris, it becomes less of an issue.
Sure.
Just because there's just less competition in terms of the rail activity. I guess the last question I have for you folks, and then I want to bring in Fran to talk about her family history. And this is from Mike Wikman, because I spoke to Mike this morning, and I asked him, did he have any questions for you guys? And he said, I'm in physical therapy. Let me think about it. I'll call you back. So he calls me back, and he says, well, the question I'd ask is, what was your interest, or let's say, if you can use the word fascination with the cutoff, or even the line in general? Because I know it over time, and this has been part of our effort with the series of videos, with the effort to reactivate the line, to, I don't want to say mystify the line, but there's certainly some, as we know from the construction and its operation and such, that there was something special about it. But I mean, each person who grew up and maybe rode the line, I rode it as a kid. My next door neighbor was a retired conductor, and I got to ride it. So in a sense, I can understand that you can have a personal connection to something, and it kind of transcends everything else. I wonder if you guys have anything like that, where you have like is there some kind of indefinable type of thing that you've experienced with it, which helps
I think
drive
it goes back to what Jerry and Bill both said. They both grew up almost touching the railroad. I did too. There's something else though. My oldest daughter, she's 48. Her first name is Phoebe. Like, what else? What else? Like, why is she named Phoebe? Well, what else would she be named? I mean, she thought the name was, when she was a teenager, she thought she should change her. The first thing I'm going to do, Dad, is when I get to be 18, is change my name to Melissa or to Jessica or something, a popular name of that time. But when she discovered she was the only Phoebe, and it was kind of everybody knew who Phoebe was.
Right.
She loved having the name. I think, we grew up believing that the Lackawanna Railroad was the greatest railroad in the United States. Is that far
That's
up,
great.
Mark?
Very well
Jerry,
run.
would you say that?
Yeah, there was a lot of people here in town. They were immigrants from mostly Italian, and they had a track gang out of Johmsonburg Station that did the cutoff. I mean, they went to work. They didn't need a car. They walked to work. And my grandfather lived a few houses up the road. That's how I learned to count. That, oh, here comes a train, here comes a train. All kind of excitement. And we counted the cars on the train. That's how I learned how to count. How many cars went by on the Lackawanna Railroad. And the equipment was fascinating. They had F units. They had these trainmaster units. And you could hear them pulling up the hill from Slateford to here. And I used to get on my bike, pedal really fast up the road, up Ramsey Road and up Cars Corner. If you pedal fast enough, you could meet the train. You can hear them pulling far away because these trainmasters made a unique sound with their exhaust and everything. So it was a little kid, you were fascinated by it. you know, looking at these locomotives and the different cars with the different writing on them. It's not like today where you have all kind of R boxes and stuff. I mean, you had Santa Fe, Southern Pacific, Atlantic Coastline, and you know, you learn how to read that way.
But you know, they're kids who grow up next to the railroad. I did as well.
Yeah.
But not everybody who grew up next to the railroad feels that. I'm just wondering if that's something that you can't, unless maybe it's your parents or how you're raised, or maybe it's just that sometimes it clicks. I don't know. I mean, any thoughts on that? I mean, it's because not everyone gravitates towards it, and some fall in love with it, and some, you know, it doesn't really.
You got to be born with a certain gene, railroad gene.
Maybe.
Well, we all date from the immediate post-war era, right?
Right.
So when we look at the other railroads, the Lackawanna shined. Especially, what do you look at first? Passenger trains. You know, I mean, that's what people gravitate. They're the ones you can ride on. And what did you see? You know, after 1949 and 1950, beautiful streamlined cars. You looked at the Jersey Central trains and the Lehigh Valley trains, you know, and they were antiques. You know, they were World War I, and this was modern. This was cool. This was like the best things on the rails, and it just looked like the perfect railroad. You know, and Lionel came up with the Trainmaster. Yeah. So you know, it was our railroad too in Scranton. I'll say this for Scranton: all the other railroads were built to Scranton. The Lackawanna Railroad was built out of Scranton. It originated in Scranton. I'm sure it acquired the Morrison-Essex Railroad at a latter point, but the genesis of it was building out. So it was always our railroad in Scranton. Like the Erie came to Scranton, the O&W came to Scranton, the Delaware and Hudson came to Scranton, Jersey Central came to Scranton, and a small way to New York, Susquehanna, and Western did too. But the Lackawanna was our railroad, and everybody identified with it. You know, there were over 10,000 Lackawanna employees in Scranton at one time before World War I. You know, so you know, I think that's part of that characterization that why is this particular railroad so important?
I wanted to raise another issue with the freight side. One of the biggest flows of traffic through Port Morris Yard was traffic to and from New England, and it ran via the Lehigh and Hudson River. And in 1974, the Poughkeepsie Bridge caught on fire, and that eliminated that as a route for freight, rail freight into New England. But before that, with the merger of the Erie and the Lackawanna, the Erie had direct access to Maybrook Yard and the Poughkeepsie Bridge, and the freight that used to go through Port Morris went via the Erie for that reason. So that's another factor that led to the decline of business, freight business on the cutoff, was the Erie Lackawanna merger and the fact that they had direct access to the New Haven Railroad and their trip over the Poughkeepsie Bridge.
Now, I remember, and because you sent it to me, there was a report done in that time frame. I want to say 1974-ish, 75. I'm not sure. That was looking at putting in some kind, I'll call it a ramp, for want of a better term, between the cutoff and the Lehigh and Hudson River Railway.
Yes.
At Greendale.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what was behind that. What would it wasn't accepted. In other words, management didn't accept whatever the recommendation or the proposal was. But it's an interesting, I'll say, artifact of history that was even being considered. What would have happened if
It was an attempt by the Erie Lackawanna to rationalize their network, and
would part of the Erie been disposed of, basically?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
most of the Delaware division, right? Would have
Right.
been
Right.
scrapped.
Yeah.
Right. But then New York State stepped up and provided some assistance, you know, to keep
That
the
that
line.
early on, because even 70, mid 70s at that time.
Sometime in there, because they had, business at Fort Mawa going at the time. So,
So clearly, that New York was attuned to the risks that were being presented with the way things were changing, which with New Jersey, and a lot of this had to do with geography, because if you look at it from New Jersey's perspective and on the Scranton division, certainly from Blairstown west, but if you're talking about freight, you're talking about an operation that has been perceived as benefiting Pennsylvania. Now, of course, the plan is to operate such that, we're talking about Amtrak now again, that there would be benefit to New Jersey. But clearly, bringing Amtrak in is the ideal, I'll say, solution, because no longer do you have to deal with New Jersey Transit viewing it as like a parochial point of view, which is understandable, that, oh, if we run to here, anything west of here, which would be either Blairstown or even Andover, is like, well, that doesn't really benefit New Jersey. And from a political standpoint, all
That's right.
politics is local. So you say, well, it benefits Pennsylvania. Well, Pennsylvania should pay for it. And Amtrak, that becomes
Right.
less of an issue, because now it's
correct.
It's part of a
viewed-
national system.
Exactly. Yes.
That had been a major problem with getting the project to where it is now. I mean, you just have one entity for you, and the other one almost diametrically opposed, because they felt New Jersey residents would be going to the Poconos instead of to Atlantic City or something like that. With the train.
Which, from a political standpoint, is understandable that would be the viewpoint, and that's where Amtrak, in a sense, cancels or negates that as an issue, because it's you're now talking about a regional approach to the service, as opposed to one that's just involving New Jersey Transit, for example.
What does Mike Wikman have to say about anything? You mentioned him.
Well, I mean, he's on board. I mean, but I've talked to him a little bit about his involvement with the project. I mean, well, with the project meaning the 79 running of Amtrak. But I haven't asked him all the questions. I was kind of like, well, I'm saving that until I actually interview him, which we hope to do sometime in late July, in person. And so that's kind of cool.
He's in Texas, though, isn't he?
San Antonio, yeah.
He's in San Antonio.
Yeah. He's been retired for quite some time, but he's.
I remember he worked here. He was a train master here, and he got hired at Missouri Pacific or Texas, but in Mineola, Texas.
He's been at
So
several different railroads over time, even when they ran into Mexico. Used to talk about. I don't have any more questions for you folks, but I know that wanted to sit Fran down and maybe talk a little bit about the history.
Great. Let me-
Unless you
I
have more.
happened to find the thing that you were just talking about.
Okay, keep it rolling.
This was the report, the use of trackage east of Binghamton, New York. It was published by the Erie Lackawanna on July 5th, 1973.
Oh, 73. Okay.
73. And Scheme C was to secure trackage rights or some form of control over the L&H Railroad between Greendale, Gray Court, Maybrook to bypass the Port Jervis route between Binghamton and Gray Court. Okay? And that Gray Court's in New York. Build new connection between the EL and L&H at Greendale. That's what you just mentioned. Upgrade the L&H between Greendale and Maybrook for maximum freight speeds of 45 miles per hour. Upgrade the connection between the EL and L&H at Gray Court. Install power switches at Greendale and Gray Court. And operate a maximum of one pair of trains per day between Maybrook and Greendale, and one pair between Mawa and Greendale by the L&H. within 2 years of, well, the year following this, the bridge at into New England burnt down, the Poughkeepsie Bridge. So one of the two trains would have been a train to nowhere if it had gone into Maybrook. So what I'm saying is that there were plans put out, but things change over time, but there was, to your point, an attempt by the Erie Lackawanna to try to find some ways to make use of the cutoff, and this was one of them. But as it stands now, the Sussex branch is abandoned, the LNH is abandoned, the LNE is abandoned, the Susquehanna is abandoned, and the cutoff is abandoned. I mean, it's just amazing what's
Railroading wiped out Northwest Jersey.
yeah. It's just amazing. It's, and it's all in our lifetimes.
Who would have dreamed the last name of all the anthracite carriers from the 19th century to still be operating would be the New York Susquehanna and Western,
They are.
right? Isn't that
Yes.
a fascinating observation?
That's why history is sometimes very, very strange. Okay, so we're back. I promised you Mike Wikman. So we're going to talk to Mike. Not here, though. We're going to find a much cooler place. This is, by the way, this is the River Walk in downtown San Antonio. What were you going to say?
A river walk that makes this town. That's the most beautiful place to walk. It's about 4 or 5 miles long. But if you got the gumption to do it, it is great. I hope you all come down here and do it. We don't have the cutoff here, though.
Pick a cooler day, though. But even so, we're going to go to a much cooler spot, and we're going to talk to Mike. We're going to talk about November 13th, 1979, the Amtrak run, which you play an integral part of. You're on the locomotive of that train. But before we actually get to that, let's talk a little bit about Mike Wikman. Before that, you have a long and storied career, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But where do you grow up, and how do you develop an interest in trains and certainly the cutoff? Because you, as you've told me off camera, that you've ridden the cutoff a number of times.
I was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania in 1934, so you can imagine how old I am. I'm so old I can't count that high. But that started me when I was about approximately 4 years old, so I was told by my father. I wanted to get out. I heard all this noise of steam locomotives. I didn't know what they were at 4. I don't believe I did. Well, Clark Summit is up on the cutoff of the Pennsylvania cutoff.
Right.
We're going to talk about the New Jersey cutoff, but I was born where the cutoff was down in Embankment. And that was my first, from that point on, I always wanted to be a locomotive engineer. My father took me down, I watched these steam locomotives climbing with the coal trains and 3-cylinder steam engines where you got that off chugging noise. It was really a great life as a kid. And so I got chances to get down there quite often. And my father used to work on a Saturday, and he would give me 8 cents to buy a half-fare ticket, and I'd ride number 2, which is the old Pocono Express, to Scranton. And I would spend until noon at the station in Scranton, Pennsylvania, watching trains, steam engines. And I got to know engineers where they let me ride the steam engine in the terminal, Scranton terminal. Well, that started me, but without going into a long spiel about me, I'm just an old rail fan. I mean, I started out, I always wanted to be a locomotive engineer, and I was very fortunate. God gave me a good life. He gave me what I wanted. I always wanted to be an engineer, and heck, that was a long time to think about as a kid. But what I did as a kid when we speaking, and we're going to be speaking about the New Jersey Cut-Off, I remember those days like it was yesterday, where those engineers, I can even name their names today. Ambrose Coughlin, he was an engineer out of Scranton that rode across the New Jersey Cut-Off. And that's where I first learned what the New Jersey Cut-Off was. And I used to ride the steam engines, which were the 1600 class. They were the 484 Northerns, or they had 5 Hudson locomotives, the 1150 class. And they had big 80-inch drivers. And I remember going across the Cut-Off with John Bleischer, an engineer out of Scranton, at over 100 mile an hour. Reason I'm saying over 100, the speedometer went to 90. That's as far as it went, and it started to shake like this, because and of course John had his watch out, and he would whisper in my ear. Now whispering on a steam locomotive going 100 mile an hour is almost deafening. He would yell in my ear. He would say, "Well, we're doing 103 mile an hour," or whatever. But was over 100 mile an hour many times going across the Cut-Off. And my father got transferred to go to New York. And we ended up in a town in New Jersey called Maplewood. And at Maplewood was the electrified line of the DL&W, which I started when I was a kid. I was really in love with the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western. And I always wanted to work for them. And I was a kid, I used to hang around the station at Maplewood. And I would do all kinds of chores like clean up the room and empty the waste baskets. The agents would let me do that. And I would go in there and listen to the telephone and the dispatchers talking on it. But these guys were like fathers to me. I mean, engineers, conductors, brakemen, I knew everybody. I used to ride the MU trains, and for nothing. They never charged me a ticket because they put me to work. They figured they got me a conductor's hat. Oh yeah, I don't have it anymore, but it said collector on it, or the badge did. And they let me wear this hat while I was riding the MUs, but they put me in the combine and say, sort the mail out and throw the mail off at these different stations. And that's what I did.
So how old are you when you're doing that?
14.
14.
Yeah,
Okay.
14, and that was the greatest part when I moved back. Because, the war was over in 46. Was it 46 or 45?
45.
And I remember, I remember getting my mother's frying pan and a couple of spoons and going out on the street and bang the frying pan with these spoons. That was the end of the war. We were celebrating the end of the Second World War. So, okay,
So how do you end up in railroading? How does that start? And how do you end up with, let's say, like the Erie Lackawanna?
Braddock said, "You need people." He said, "I need people so bad." He said, "Here, you got this guy right here." So I got a job as a towerman. A towerman operator was my first job on the DL&W Railroad, not the Erie Lackawanna yet. So they shipped me to Montclair, and I knew who was up there. I'm trying to think of his name, but right now hey, at this age I'm lucky I can think of my own name. But I go to Montclair and I post up at Montclair and I get qualified. But a lot of stories goes along with that one too. But the next place I went was Walter Killaley down at Roseville Avenue, and I was a towerman there. Then I go to Orange, New Jersey with, what the heck was his name? Norman Redding. He was a towerman there, and I got qualified those. Then they send me to Newark to qualify at Newark, and the towerman that was there.
Is he high and wide?
Huh?
Norman Redding?
Yeah.
High and
wide, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
You know him?
No, but his name came up. Artie Erdman was talking
Arthur
about.
Erdman. I knew Artie Erdman there, sure. Artie was just a little kid when he came in. He was a towerman. Of course, at that time I was just promoted to an engineer. But this is funny. I mean, I'm bringing up names because some of you guys that's looking at this probably will know these guys. And Norman and I got to be the best of friends. He was kind of a rail fan. Of course, I've always been a rail fan. I mean, but when you get to be on the railroad, you got to stop that because they don't like rail fans on the railroad. So I had to kind of keep it low. Oh, what was funny? When I first it got well. December of '54, I got my first job as a locomotive fireman in Hoboken. Chet brought me over, and so I'm now a fireman, and I'm working all the different jobs around. And but the stories there, I could go all day on that one, but no, I won't. I won't do that. But I just want to tell you that now don't forget, I have a high school education. That's all I had. But Mr. Maxwell, the president of the Erie Lackawanna, we merged with the Erie in 1960, and we had the Erie men and the Lackawanna men now. We're squabbling with each other about, but I won't go into that. That's a long story. But I'm thinking about why I'm sitting here right this minute. We're talking about the New Jersey Cut-Off. So this whole talk, the only reason I'm bringing up anything about me is I guess I'm one of the last guys I talked to Irwin Flynn, by the way, the other day. He called. And Irwin Flynn, I used to fire for him. He was an engineer. I used to work with his father. So the New Jersey Cut-Off is near and dear to me. I've been through all that cut-off, not only being a kid, but I always on the cut-off for being a locomotive fireman and a locomotive engineer. So I worked out of Port Morris, the different jobs we had out of Port Morris. We used to have a local that runs down to Blairstown and Greendale. We had cars for Greendale once in a while, Blairstown. But the New Jersey Cut-Off, that was home to me. Port Morris, I tried to work in Port Morris every chance I got. And my seniority would kind of make me halfway. I could work, most of the time I had to work in Hoboken. But every time there was an opening in Port Morris, I'd always go back to it because I lived 10 minutes away at Bud Lake. But but Port Morris was home. And
Erie Lackawanna will go out of existence in 1976 with the creation of Conrail.
Yep.
Do you make it to the end of Erie Lackawanna days, or do you?
No.
No, you leave before that.
I left in 1973. The reason I left, not because I really wanted to, but I got an offer from Don Nelson, D.N. Nelson. He was general superintendent of the Jersey Central, or the CNJ, and Terry Casey, who was the general road foreman for the CNJ, he quit. There's a story about that, but
Okay, well, I want to talk about November of 1979. You're with Amtrak at that point.
yeah.
And at some point, you are notified that you're going to be on a train that's going to go to Scranton, but it doesn't happen exactly that way.
No.
You tell the story of how do you end up on the locomotive of the November 13th, 1979 special from Hoboken to Scranton.
Okay. It's I was in Seattle, and I got a call from my boss who said, get to Philadelphia as quick as you can because there's a special going out and the vice president wants you on that train. And what train? I said, what? Well, when you get there, you'll find out. So I'm in Seattle, so I got to go back to get the hotel, get my stuff, go to SeaTac Airport, and get a plane. So I have no idea where I'm going. I have no idea. Because he wouldn't tell me. Because I don't think he knew. So I go to Philadelphia, and I get there about, oh God, I think about 2 or 3 in the morning. And I was told to be there by 7:15. 7:15 they told me to be there. So I didn't get much sleep. I got maybe a couple of hours sleep. And of course on the airplane, I can't sleep on an airplane. I'm a white knuckle flyer. But I went from there down to the station, and I can't think of the name of the road foreman's name anymore. But he told me what downtown. He said downstairs there's a F40, and you're going to go into Hoboken. And he says, from Hoboken, it's what he said, I think you're going to Scranton. And I said, no, there's no way I could go to Scranton. The track is taken out at Port Morris. So okay. So I go downstairs, and there's I see my vice president, who, I wish I could think of his last name. He used to be a CNW superintendent, but that vice president, for some reason, he liked me. And anytime there was a special, he would want me to be on it. With him especially. Well, Alden, his assistant, was on that train. So I go downstairs and I said, where are we going? And he said, well, you're going to go to Kearney Junction. We're going to back over at Kearney Junction. You're going to go down to, you're going to go into Hoboken. Oh. Well, when I get down and talk to the people at home, they said, no, you're going to Scranton. I said, we can't go to Scranton. The rail's taken out at Port Morris. Well, we're gonna do it. Well, I go down, I meet everybody. The engineer was a corridor man I knew, and we went to Hoboken. We went to Kearney Junction, back down from Hudson Tower into Kearney Junction, and go in on the Lackawanna. I mean, I hadn't been there in years. Well, my ex-partner, Jimmy Lyons, Jimmy was a road foreman for the Erie Lackawanna. Of course, when I left, he stayed there till he retired. And Jimmy was my engineer. I said, this is like old times. Here I am working for Amtrak. Of course, Jimmy knew where I was. Jimmy and I would talk, doing our careers. We would talk maybe once every 2 or 3 or 4 months. I don't know. I would call him sometimes, and he would call me. But he always thought, when I gave up my seniority on the CNJ to go, well, that's another story right there. But how I kept my seniority, well, I finally had to give up my seniority. He thought I was stupid, but he said, you're having more fun traveling around the United States than I ever did. I said, well, but Jimmy was the engineer on that train, and we were going to Scranton. Mr. Downing, who was my general superintendent, was on the train. Bill Sheppard was on the train. I've known Bill for years. He was a towerman at one time himself, so he was on the train. But he was working for Conrail at that time, and we had a great discussion going. But I spent most of the time on the engine because Jimmy didn't know the blended brake, how to use the blended brake, so. We had Billy Morgan was the conductor, and we went to Port Morris, but we went around the Y at Port Morris because the track was just what I said it was. The track was gone. They took the rail up right outside of UN Tower, and it was a miserable day, dark, kind of a light rain, dark, and the cutoff was. The rails were heavy rust. I don't think anything had been on that track, but we were really the last train to go across the New Jersey Cut-Off, and I don't know what the bosses were doing back in the private car, but they were. So we were just cruising along, and Jimmy knew we were. Well, I think we weren't doing much more than 40 all the way. As I remember, I don't know if Bill hears this, he probably knows exactly how fast we were going, but we slowed down at Greendale, really slow. We went by Green. They wanted to look at what's left of it. And Johmsonburg, we went through there kind of slow and looked at, there was nothing much left there anymore. And of course, Blairstown was the station was still there. The Blairstown station was still there. And it was a radio station, as I remember, at that time. And the city of the town of Blairstown was kind of down, maybe a couple of miles away from where the station is. But all the tracks had gone. Where we used to bring freight cars out there at Blairstown, and well, And we went across the Paulins Kill Viaduct. I couldn't believe what it looked like at the time. Here was one rusty track, and going across this beautiful bridge that was made there. A typical Lackawanna type bridge, cement, and they had all kinds of metal. Those bridges were made to last, and they did. And in fact, they still exist today. But of course, there's no railroad on top of it. And of course, we went all the way into Pennsylvania at Slateford Junction, where we met the old road, came out from Portland. So that track was still in there, to Portland. But I think that was the end, wasn't it, at Portland? And
yeah, it went over the Delaware River, but there were no tracks in New Jersey.
Right. But when I talk about the old road, the old road came out at Slateford Junction. That's now we're in Pennsylvania, and now the track is owned by the Delaware and Lackawanna Railroad, which is David Monteverdi's railroad.
That's today, but at that time it was Conrail.
Yeah, that's right. It was Conrail at the time. Of course, Conrail is the one who abandoned it.
Right. Yes.
But I mean, I never thought the day would ever come when I would see them abandon that railroad. I mean, what a beautiful railroad that was, the New Jersey Cut-Off. Even down to one track, it was.
So so in terms of the special, the train will end up in Scranton, although it does stop in East Stroudsburg.
Yeah.
There's also a photograph that was taken on Peak West Phil, which would have been like between Andover and Greendale. Now, you had your camera with you.
Oh, yes.
So you took a lot of photos that day.
Well, yeah. In fact, I think they're the only photographs that were taken on that train.
Certainly on the train. Well, this trip, the way I understand it, and it was in the previous interview that I did with Bill Sheppard and Dominic Keating, they talk about the fact that they were told, they were given basically more or less an ultimatum that they were not to spread the word. In other words, they wanted this to be hush-hush. And I don't know if that was told to you or not, but...
No, it wasn't, but I didn't know that until Bill told me about that later on that day when we got to Scranton, because they didn't want to know, because they were going to abandon the Scranton yard and move everything to Taylor. So he asked me, if you meet up any Lackawanna, don't say anything. Don't say anything about it. I said, I don't care. What do I care? You know, I worked for the Amtrak at that time, and I knew what they were up to. I knew what Bill did. I know what he does.
Well, you're on the engine. Now, what is exactly your function on the engine? They didn't put you on there just to ride along. Were you there in case there was a problem with the engine?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I was a high-priced babysitter.
Okay, so in case something went wrong, you would be there to fix it so they didn't get stuck in the
Nobody
middle of
knew the F-40 on the crew. The whole crew knew nothing about an F-40. And the F-40s, they were kind of, they weren't troublesome, but they did have their problems. And this vice president, he wanted me on those specials. But Mr. Clater was the only president of a railroad that I've ever known that called me a high-priced babysitter. but he's right. He was right. I was there on that trip across the cutoff, more or less, to get that train to work, because they knew the people who were on it.
Now, if you can recall, because now it's 44 years later, coming up on it, and what kind of chatter is going on? Is there any kind of thought, or any kind of talk of, would Amtrak ever take over the route, or?
That was a big thing.
I mean, what kind of stuff were they talking about? What kind of stuff were they talking? What?
I'll shut her up.
What kind of stuff were they talking about on the locomotive? I mean, did that ever come up that, we might be running here at some point?
Yes. Oh yes, because I had Jimmy and Morgan, the conductor, were up there. Were on the engine, so there was 3 of us up there. And you know what an F40 has, a flop seat with a little spring on it. That's where I sat. That little flop seat is perfect for me. But yeah, Morgan's asking me because I'm from Amtrak, and he knew me when I was with the Erie Lackawanna. He knew me. Morgan's a good guy too.
Who's the locomotive engineer who's qualified to run on the cutoff, even though the cutoff is out of service at this point?
Yeah.
Who is actually qualified to run the engine?
Jimmy Lyons.
He was. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Jimmy was the road foreman, and I understand that it was done so fast that he had to ride, and he wanted to do it anyway. He wanted to do it. Jimmy was a closet rail fan. Jimmy, if you hear that, I don't know where he is, but I used to call him the closet rail fan. He said, "I'm not a rail fan. I don't like no." But yeah, that Jimmy asked me. He said, "Are we going to be going to Scranton?" And I said, "I don't know, Jimmy. I know they want to. They want to. Yes, they want to. That's Amtrak. The vice
You say
president.
want to. You're not just talking about that one particular trip.
Yeah.
You're talking about actually running a service
Yes.
of some sort.
Oh, yes. And Morgan said something that he heard from the union that I'm trying to think of. It's so hard to remember anymore. But he said something about the union. He knew the tracks were going to come back, and yet they tear the track up. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, if the union knew about it, that they were planning on
Which
going,
union are we talking about now?
the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen and Conductors and Trainmen. He
okay.
was, as I remember,
So that union isn't specific to one railroad.
No, it's national. And they bring up something, but the only thing I heard from Bill told me that he was just to see what they could do away with. He didn't say it that way, but he said that he's up to look, because we went down on the Lehigh Valley on the way back to Philadelphia. We went back we turned the train over to the people in Philadelphia when we got finished. And I went on my way and they went on, that was the end of it. But Downing, the Erie Lackawanna guy, as I remember, Downing got off and I don't remember anymore. Bill might know, but I think he got off in Scranton. But I stayed on the engine the whole time because of they didn't know where we got a pilot from the Lehigh Valley. It took us down around Coxton. And I don't remember anymore. We got a Reading engineer somewhere. I don't know where we got this Reading, and it took us into Philadelphia. But that was the end of the train right there. But we were the last train, they said, that ran over to Cut-Off.
So you end up where you started the day, right?
Yeah.
Because you had started in Philadelphia.
And it was dark. It was nighttime when we got to Philadelphia, because I was dead tired, as I remember. I didn't go home until the next day, and I went home on the Broadway, as I remember. I don't mind riding trains, but I don't like airplanes. I'm not much for, as I say, I'm a white knuckle flyer. But yet with Amtrak, that's all I did is fly. But because when I came to Amtrak, they gave me a airline credit card. I said, "What's that for?" "Oh, you'll find out." I did. But I've had a wonderful career. I'd do it again tomorrow. I just wish I could go run trains now, but I can't, so suck my thumb.
Oh, there you go.
Well, thank you for putting up with me. I talk a lot, yes I do, but...
Well, thank you for sitting down and giving us a little bit of a snippet of your history. I'm sure that we could go on for...
Oh, yes. There's so many...
We've gotten the highlights, perhaps,
Yeah.
but certainly that you could go on for much, much, much longer.
But railroad men, no matter who they are, they all have stories to tell. And I used to love to listen to the older men when I was a kid, telling me stories about how they ran trains. But
Well, I wonder if that's part of the appeal to railroading, above and beyond just running the trains. But there is that sense of community or camaraderie, but also that there's just so many interesting things that can happen. Some good, some bad.
sure.
You know,
Sure.
just because you running a railroad is that kind of thing.
But what else do I have left? That's all I got's memories. As long as God gives me a mind. And you could lose that with a stroke in a matter of seconds. You could lose whatever memory I had. So I'm very thankful that I could be here today talking to you, because I love the memories. And
Well, I'm thankful too, and I know we've been talking about doing this for quite some time,
Yeah.
and I know at one point we were actually thinking about doing it in New Jersey, but hey, we did it in San Antonio.
well, I can't fly anymore because they tell me like vertigo. I've had trouble with that.
Mhm.
And the doctor said if you go up and fly in an airplane, it's liable to start off and it's liable you landing and it'll still be in vertigo.
Mm.
So I've been very, as I say, I've been given a gift, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. And as I say, today I miss doing what I used to do. Even though it was long hours, I had a wonderful wife who put up with me being away for weeks on it. When I went to Alaska, I was up there for June, end of June, July, August, and early part of September.
I remember my next door neighbor when I was growing up, and this is we're talking about the early '60s. Is about the time I got to ride the Phoebe Snow with him and his wife, the Brightspreckers, and who you probably don't remember because he was retired by that time.
Yeah,
the early
no,
60s.
I don't recognize the name.
But I remember as a kid, I was fascinated because we lived next to the railroad. I was fascinated by it, and I wanted to be a railroader. And I remember being out there, and he's tending his garden. It's on a nice warm day, and I said, Mr. Brightsprecker, I'd like to be an engineer. I don't remember exactly, but I wanted to be a railroader, whatever terminology I used at age 5, 6, or whatever. He said, oh, you don't want to do that. You'll be away from your family too much. I remember those words. And it sounds like, that was your experience.
Oh, absolutely. But I had a wonderful wife who had her own life, really. She brought the kids up. I didn't. I mean,
and I've heard this from, I remember when I interviewed John Sabatka, he said the exact same thing.
Yeah.
It was, and Bob Bars as well said the same thing. It was very tough in the family.
I know Bob well. Of course, he's not very happy with me. Well, it's the old word politics. Well, you and I even have had a few, but that I don't think about
Well, I
that.
think we've overlooked that. I mean,
Yes, thank God, because you're a very talented guy, and what you've done. I mean, I want to say this. I hope to everybody. What you've done is nobody done what you've done. To save a piece of railroad that's near and dear to my heart is that New Jersey Cut-Off. And I maybe I live here, but my mind is up there. I would love to live in New Jersey, but I can't afford it.
Well, I'll just say this, that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of people, and that's not an exaggeration, who have contributed. I contributed, yes, I won't minimize my own contribution, but Chuck Walsh didn't save the Cut-Off. It's a long list of people who contribute over a long period of time to do it, and it's not over yet. It's not a done deal
No, it's
yet.
not.
But it's hopefully going in that direction. We'll
But
see.
you talking to Larry Malski up there in Scranton, that episode you had sitting in his office, that
Right.
was fabulous. I mean, here's a guy with power, and you're
And we were talking about Amtrak back then.
Yes.
That's long before Amtrak.
in
Made
Bridge
us-
60. I used to go up Bridge 60 when it was a tower, is what it was. But now today it's
What's an office now?
yes,
But,
but to see you guys have saved this piece of railroad. When I think about what you talked about, that guy who owned the Cut-Off wanted to take the Pequest Fill, and
Turco, yeah.
I think about that. And,
I mean, there's quite a story associated with it, but what I'm getting at is that there's so many people over a period of time, and sometimes the contributions were, you know, limited in that period of time.
Yeah.
But it all collectively has gotten us to where we are now,
Yes.
where Amtrak may, I say
Yeah.
may return, this time not for just one trip, but actually run service, which was the whole idea behind
3
1979.
trains a day up there. I saw the schedule.
We'll see, you know, we'll see. Okay, well, thank you for watching our video. All the interviews with Bill, Dom, Jerry, and Mike. Hey, stay tuned for more about the Lackawanna Cut-Off and Amtrak. We'll see what happens. It's coming up. We'll get an announcement from Amtrak and the FRA. But we'll see what happens. There's not a done deal, but hey, keep in mind that Amtrak has been here before.